In forgotten places where patterns gather quietly, where silence observes longer than history, justice does not arrive suddenly, it accumulates choice by choice, echo by echo, until the moment arrives when the spiral completes its turn and the world listens. This is whispers of reckoning. Pressure rarely announces itself. It gathers. Quietly. Like clouds that build across an empty sky long before the first drop of rain falls. Most people do not notice pressure forming. They notice the storm. But the storm is only the echo. The real story begins earlier. In small moments. Invisible moments. Moments when something inside a system begins to tighten. Season after season. Decision after decision. Until eventually, something must move. The spiral had been turning for centuries. No one knew when it started. Only that it continued. Across rivers. Across mountains. Across deserts. Across cities where millions lived without ever noticing the quiet alignment forming beneath their lives. Pressure. Choice. Echo. Again. And again. And again. The ledger had recorded hundreds of them. Isaac Bell's maps had traced thousands more. Yet the pattern had always remained incomplete. Until now. 5 pressure points remained. 5 moments where the spiral would finish its first rotation. No one knew exactly what that meant. But everyone involved understood one thing clearly. When patterns complete themselves, systems change. 3 days after the archive meeting, Elena Ruiz stood beside the rail junction outside Carson Valley. The air felt unusually still. Freight traffic continued moving through the corridor. Engines rumbling. Steel wheels grinding softly against tracks. Everything appeared normal. Yet Elena could feel tension inside the system. Not mechanical tension. Something else. Expectation. The first coordinate from the ledger. Pressure point 1. Rail junctions are complicated places. Multiple tracks intersecting. Switches controlling direction. Cargo trains arriving from opposite sides of the mountains. Dispatchers balancing momentum across steel pathways. Under ordinary conditions the system operated smoothly. But today something felt different. Traffic density had increased unexpectedly. 3 freight trains scheduled within the same 30-minute window. Heavy cargo. Tight timing. Pressure building quietly inside the system. Elena checked the dispatch tablet again. All signals appeared green. Schedules remained intact. Yet she recognized the familiar sensation. The same tension she had felt the night of the canyon incident. Momentum approaching a narrow decision. Across the yard a locomotive horn echoed sharply. One train arriving early. Another approaching faster than expected. Steel momentum gathering at the junction. The system could handle it. If every engineer followed the schedule precisely. If every signal responded instantly. If every switch aligned perfectly. Systems depend on those small words. If. Elena stepped closer to the control panel beside the maintenance shed. Her hand hovered near the manual override lever. Most dispatching occurred remotely. But the junction still allowed manual control when necessary. Just in case. Just in moments when pressure rose faster than software could adapt. Moments like this. The first train entered the junction corridor. A heavy grain shipment heading north. Momentum steady. Speed controlled. The second train appeared moments later. Fuel tankers. Moving west. Both trains remained within safe timing. For now. Then Elena noticed the third signal blinking amber. An unscheduled freight convoy approaching from the east. 3 trains. 1 junction. 10 minutes. Pressure building. She checked the schedule again. The convoy had been delayed earlier that morning. Dispatch had accelerated its route to recover lost time. which meant the system now contained more momentum than expected. 3 trains. 3 directions. One set of switches controlling them all. Elena felt the familiar calculation forming in her mind. Timing. Distance. Speed. Momentum. Pressure rising across steel rails. The spiral had reached its first point. Across the yard someone stepped into view. Standing near the far signal tower. Hands in his coat pockets. Watching. The reckoning traveler. Elena recognized him instantly. The same calm posture. The same quiet attention. He did not wave. Did not approach. He simply observed. As if confirming that the moment had arrived. Elena returned her focus to the control panel. 3 trains approaching the junction. Software routing still predicted safe passage. But the margin had narrowed. A slight delay. A minor braking error. A misaligned switch. Any small mistake could redirect thousands of tons of steel into catastrophe. Pressure waited inside the system. Someone needed to guide it. The radio crackled. Dispatch, junction control. The grain train engineer. We're approaching the North Line. Confirmed, Elena replied. Maintain speed. Another voice broke in. Fuel tanker engineer. Westbound approaching the corridor. Hold position for 2 minutes. A pause. Copy that. Then the third voice. Convoy freight. Eastbound entering junction range. Elena's eyes moved across the signal board. 3 trains. 3 directions. One decision approaching. She glanced toward the traveler again. He remained exactly where he had been. Watching. Listening. Not intervening. Because the spiral never forced a decision. It waited for one. Elena studied the system one more time. If she held the convoy outside the corridor, the other 2 trains would clear safely. But the delay would create congestion across the entire mountain network. Hours of traffic backup. Economic losses. Dispatch complaints. Another option existed. Redirect the grain train temporarily onto the southern maintenance spur. A narrow line rarely used for freight. Similar to the canyon switch weeks earlier. Safe if handled slowly. Risky if misjudged. Pressure could move either way. The spiral had reached its first choice. Elena's hand rested on the lever. Steel momentum approaching the junction. 3 trains. 3 directions. Pressure waiting. Choice forming. Across the yard the traveler remained motionless. Listening. Because the spiral never demanded action. It waited for alignment. Elena pulled the lever. The switch motors engaged beneath the rails. Steel tracks shifted slowly. The grain train diverted toward the southern spur. Momentum moved sideways. The tanker train rolled safely through the main corridor. Moments later the convoy entered the junction without conflict. 3 trains passed through the system. No collision. No derailment. Just redirected pressure. Elena exhaled slowly. The spiral had turned once more. Across the yard the traveler nodded slightly. Not approval. Recognition. Pressure. Choice. Echo. Far beyond the junction clouds began gathering above the valley. A storm forming earlier than forecast. Not dramatic. Not destructive. Just enough rain to slow the freight convoy's journey across the desert. Preventing a mechanical overheating issue that would have occurred hours later under extreme heat. Another echo. Another quiet adjustment. Another turn of the spiral. The first pressure point had passed. 4 remained. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the next moment was already approaching. By the time the freight junction settled back into routine, the storm that had formed above the valley had already moved east. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just enough. A delay in rain. A cooler rail bed. A convoy that would now reach the desert crossing after sunrise instead of before it. Small shifts. Barely worth notice to anyone who did not understand the pattern. But Elena understood it now. Pressure had risen. A choice had redirected momentum. And the world had answered in its own language. Not loudly. Never loudly. With timing. With alignment. With consequence moving somewhere else. She stood beside the control panel for several seconds after the trains cleared. The yard resumed. Its ordinary sound. Engines idling. Metal cooling. A distant horn somewhere beyond the western ridge. No one else in the junction yard knew anything unusual had happened. To them it was just another manual correction. Just another decision made by someone trained to make them. But Elena knew the ledger had predicted this moment before the trains ever entered the corridor. 5 pressure points. Now 4 remained. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the brass whistle there. The spiral engraved into the metal felt smooth beneath her fingers. A reminder. Not of what had happened. Of what was still coming. Across the yard, the traveler was gone. No departing footsteps. No car leaving the maintenance road. Just empty light around the signal tower and a morning that looked ordinary enough to fool anyone passing through. Elena looked up at the sky. Clouds drifted thinly across the blue. Far to the east a darker bank of weather gathered over the next mountain chain. Pressure moving on. Always moving on. She took out her phone. A message from Isaac Bell waited on the screen. First point confirmed. For remain. Next basin window opens before dusk. No greeting. No explanation. None needed. Elena read the message once more, then slid the phone back into her pocket and headed for her truck. 2 counties away, Aaron Cole was already at the river. He had not slept much since Bell's call the previous evening. The engineer in him distrusted predictions. The man who had stood beside a levee crack and chosen a floodplain over a neighborhood distrusted coincidence. Between those 2 forms of skepticism, he had learned a new habit. He no longer dismissed pressure just because it arrived without a familiar explanation. Bell had called shortly after sunset. Not with certainty. With a warning. Another pressure point is forming, he had said. Same basin system. Timing uncertain. Probably within 24 hours. Aaron had looked out his office window toward the Halstead River then, calm beneath late-season light. The flood redesign work was still ongoing. New overflow channels had been cut but not fully reinforced. Temporary gates remained in place while crews finished the retaining shelves on the eastern side of the restored wetland basin. If heavy pressure hit the system now, the river would find the unfinished sections first. Aaron had driven out before dawn. The valley still held mist near the ground when he arrived. The river itself looked almost innocent. Steady current. No storm runoff. No visible rise. Just water moving within its banks with the calm confidence of something that never needs to prove what it can do. Construction crews were already on site, setting forms for the final concrete spill lip near the north diversion channel. Survey flags trembled in the morning breeze. Mud had dried into cracked dark plates where last season's floodwater had withdrawn. The redesigned landscape was beginning to look intentional. Less like damage. More like a new way of listening. Aaron walked the channel edge slowly. He knew every grade change by heart now. Every outlet angle. Every point where pressure would gather if the river surged unexpectedly. Nothing looked wrong. Yet by mid-morning the first upstream gauge ticked higher. Not much. Just enough to move from ordinary flow to elevated release. Then a second gauge followed. Aaron frowned and checked the weather feed. No major rain upstream. No sudden snowmelt event. Reservoir releases remained unchanged. Still, the numbers rose. Pressure entering the system without a visible storm. He remembered the girl by the river. Barefoot in the rain. Watching the current. The river remembers pressure. Back then the words had sounded like metaphor. Now they sounded more like engineering stripped of arrogance. One of the site supervisors approached, hard hat tucked under one arm. "We're seeing faster flow through the North Channel," he said. "I know," Aaron replied. "You expecting runoff?" "No," the supervisor looked toward the water. "You want us to stop work?" Aaron did not answer immediately. Stopping work early would delay the reinforcement schedule another day, maybe two if contractors had to be rescheduled. Keeping crews near unfinished earthworks while flow pressure rose unexpectedly carried its own risk. Neither choice felt dramatic enough yet to justify an alarm. That was how pressure liked to begin. Small enough to rationalize. Clear enough to be regretted later. "Pull everyone back from the north cut," Aaron said. "Keep the excavators where they are but clear the lower shelf." The supervisor nodded and jogged off to relay the order. Aaron took out his phone and opened the county monitoring dashboard. 3 gauges now showed a coordinated rise. A line. A direction. The basin was receiving force from somewhere upstream that the models had not captured. His phone buzzed. A second message from Bell. "Does the water look ordinary?" Aaron stared at the screen for a second, then typed back. "Yes. That's the problem." No reply came. None needed. By early afternoon the sky had darkened, though no real storm had formed. Clouds passed over the valley in high gray bands. Wind moved across the reeds in the restored wetland shelves, flattening them in waves that looked almost like the surface of the river itself. Aaron stood on the service road above the North Channel and watched the current accelerate. Still no flood. Still no emergency. Yet the unfinished reinforcement berm at the far end of the channel had begun to slough at its base. Not failure. Not yet. A quiet giving way. Mud loosening where water pressure had found the unprotected section and started persuading it toward movement. The site supervisor came back up the slope. "We've got seepage under the temporary retaining shelf," he said. Aaron nodded. He had already seen it. If the shelf undercuts, the new channel wall won't hold the next surge. How much time? Aaron looked at the flow rate again. Not long. Minutes? An hour? Hard to tell. Pressure systems do not always announce their thresholds. They creep toward them until someone mistakes delay for safety. "Move the crews to the west bank," Aaron said. "Now." The supervisor hesitated. "That means shutting the whole section down." "Yes." Before the man could go, a voice behind them said quietly, "The water's choosing early." Aaron turned. The traveler stood beside the old survey post near the edge of the service road. No mud on his boots. No hard hat. No reason for him to be there beyond the same reason he ever appeared near these moments. He listened. The supervisor looked confused. "Who's that?" Aaron answered without taking his eyes off the man. "Go move the crews." The supervisor, sensing something in Aaron's tone that discouraged further questions, headed down the slope. The traveler looked out over the channel. "You changed the basin," he said. "Yes." "And pressure still found it." "Yes." The traveler nodded faintly. "Good." Aaron frowned. "Good." "You're no longer asking whether pressure will come," the traveler said. "Only where it can move without becoming harm." Aaron followed his gaze to the unfinished north shelf. Water pressed harder there now, chewing at the lower edge. If that section fails, Aaron said, the channel cuts across the work zone. And the crews? Gone, if the supervisor listened. The traveler's expression did not change. Then the choice is already moving. Aaron looked at him sharply. That's not reassuring. It isn't meant to be. The channel gave a low cracking sound. Earth shifted. A section of the temporary shelf dropped 6 inches in one motion. Water slammed through the gap, widening it instantly. Aaron swore under his breath and ran downslope toward the control box for the east relief gate. The redesigned basin included a secondary release chute not yet scheduled to open for another 2 weeks. The chute fed into the old marshland west of the main channel, away from the work zone but across newly seeded restoration ground the county had spent months preparing. If he opened it now, he would protect the crews and preserve the unfinished north wall. He would also wash out the new restoration planting and likely set the project back months. Pressure. Choice. Echo. He reached the control box and keyed the override. A warning light blinked red. Unscheduled relief release. The county would not like that. The restoration board would like it even less. Water pressure did not care. He entered the manual code and hit release. Downstream, steel gates shuddered, then began to rise. The current changed almost instantly. The force pounding the north shelf split sideways into the western marsh corridor. Water raced into the seeded wetlands, flattening young grasses, spreading through low ground that had only recently begun looking alive again. Behind him the unfinished shelf held. Not because pressure vanished. Because it moved. A minute later the supervisor's voice came over the radio, breathless. West Bank crews are clear. We saw the surge. If we'd stayed in the cut, he didn't finish. Aaron didn't need him to. He watched the western marsh fill and felt the old familiar weight of necessary damage settle into place. He had chosen again. Not the clean outcome. The survivable one. When he turned back toward the service road, the traveler was gone. In his place, caught against the old survey post by a strand of wind-flattened grass, was a narrow strip of tarnished metal. Aaron walked up and pulled it free. A brass survey tag, decades old, punched through at one end for fastening to chain or stake. On its face, almost worn away, the spiral. He closed his hand around it and looked out over the basin. The crews were safe. The north wall would stand. The new marsh planting was lost. By evening the county would call this a setback. By winter, perhaps, they would call it an adjustment. By next spring, maybe, they would understand it as instruction. The second pressure point had passed. Somewhere far away, Bell would already be marking it. Somewhere else, Elena would feel the pattern tighten. And somewhere beyond the next horizon, the third choice was already beginning to form. Aaron took out his phone and sent one message. Second point confirmed. Water moved west. No injuries. This time Bell replied immediately. 3 remain. Harbor at first light. Aaron looked once more at the flooded marsh. The world did not reward choices. It recorded them. And when enough had accumulated, patterns began to speak. He slipped the survey tag into his pocket and headed back toward the county road as clouds thickened above the valley. Behind him, the redirected water spread through the reeds in widening arcs that looked almost like writing from above. Not words. Something older. A shape the land already knew. A spiral turning. The harbor woke before the sun. Fishing towns always do. Engines started in the dark. Deck lights flickered across the water like small constellations floating on black glass. Ropes creaked. Metal hooks tapped against railings. The smell of salt, diesel, and cold morning air filled the docks. Most mornings followed the same rhythm. Boats leaving. Boats returning. Weather checked. Cargo weighed. But on this morning the wind moved strangely across the harbor. Not strong. Not threatening. Just, unsettled. As if the ocean had begun thinking about something. Captain Daniel Mercer noticed it first. He stood on the edge of Pier 3 with a mug of black coffee in one hand. His boat rocked gently against the dock. The tide chart predicted calm conditions until afternoon. But the water did not move like calm water. Subtle cross-currents rippled between the mooring posts. Small eddies formed where none should have existed. Daniel watched the tide long enough to recognize the difference between randomness and pressure. This was pressure. Quiet. Invisible. But building. 2 years earlier he would have ignored it. Dismissed the feeling. Blamed fatigue or imagination. But the ocean had already taught him a lesson about listening. Sometimes pressure does not announce itself with storms. Sometimes it whispers through currents. He finished the coffee slowly. Then pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. A message waited. From Isaac Bell. Third point approaching. Harbor conditions unstable. Be near the water. Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds. He had never told Bell which harbor he worked from. Yet the man had somehow known. The spiral had reached the coast. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and stepped onto the dock. Fishermen moved around him preparing their boats. No one looked worried. No one noticed the strange tension in the water. Why would they? Pressure rarely reveals itself until the moment it moves. The tide shifted again. Just slightly. A ripple crossed the harbor mouth. Then another. Daniel turned toward the open sea. Something large moved beneath the surface. Not a wave. Not a boat. The movement traveled across the water like a slow breath rising from deep below. He felt the familiar sensation in his chest. The same one he had felt the day he pulled the drowning stranger from the fog. Pressure. Choice approaching. A shout came from the far pier. Someone pointing toward the harbor entrance. A small cargo vessel had entered too fast. The boat carried stacked metal containers bound for coastal distribution. Nothing unusual about that. Except the vessel's rudder was fighting the current. The captain corrected. Then corrected again. The harbor tide had begun turning earlier than forecast. The incoming current clashed against the outgoing tide. A rare condition. Not dangerous under ordinary circumstances. Unless a boat entered the harbor at speed. Which this one had. The vessel lurched sideways. Dock workers shouted. Ropes flew through the air. The ship's horn blasted once. Long urgent. Momentum pushed the vessel toward the fuel dock. Hundreds of gallons of diesel sat beneath that pier. One impact could rupture the tanks. One spark could ignite the entire harbor. Pressure. Choice. Echo. Daniel moved before he fully understood why. He untied his trawler in one motion. The engine roared alive. The small boat shot away from Pier 3. Dock workers shouted after him. But Daniel ignored them. He aimed straight toward the drifting cargo vessel. Not to stop it. That would be impossible. To redirect it. The harbor current pulled the larger ship toward the fuel pier. Daniel steered his smaller boat across its bow. Close enough for the captain to see him clearly. Then he signaled. 2 quick horn blasts. Left. The cargo captain hesitated. Daniel blasted again. Left. The signal meant one thing. Turn toward the shallow sandbar. The captain understood instantly. He spun the wheel. The vessel's engines roared. The ship's bow shifted away from the fuel pier. Toward the sandbar at the harbor edge. Momentum changed direction. The cargo vessel slammed into the shallow bank seconds later. Metal containers rattled violently. Water surged around the hull. But the ship stopped. No explosion. No ruptured tanks. Just steel resting against sand and mud. Pressure redirected. Dock workers ran toward the stranded vessel. Voices shouting. Engines reversing. Lines thrown across the water. Daniel cut his motor and drifted nearby. The harbor slowly calmed. The strange cross-current faded. The tide resumed its ordinary rhythm. As if the ocean itself had finished adjusting. Daniel looked toward the far end of the pier. The traveler stood there. Hands in his coat pockets. Watching the harbor quietly. The same calm presence Daniel remembered from the fog. The man nodded once. Not approval. Recognition. Pressure. Choice. Echo. A gust of wind swept across the pier. When Daniel looked again, the traveler had vanished. In his place something glinted beside the dock cleat. Daniel climbed onto the pier and picked it up. A small brass compass. Old. Heavy. Along the rim, the spiral. He turned the compass slowly in his hand. The needle spun once. Then steadied. Pointing inland. Daniel exhaled slowly. The spiral had moved again. 3 pressure points passed. 2 remained. And somewhere far beyond the harbor, the next decision had already begun forming. By the time the harbor calmed, the desert had already begun heating. The 3rd pressure point had passed quietly along the coast. No explosion. No fire. Just a redirected ship resting against a sandbar. Momentum moved. Pressure released. The spiral turned again. Now only 2 points remained. And the 4th was already forming beneath the high desert sun. Miles inland, the land looked empty. Sand. Rock. Wind pushing thin lines of dust across the highway. Nothing about the landscape suggested danger. But power stations are not built in empty places by accident. They are built where pressure gathers. Where heat moves through wires. Where energy crosses long distances through steel and copper. And sometimes, where systems forget how fragile balance really is. The Halcyon solar grid stretched across the desert like a quiet mechanical sea. Thousands of mirrored panels reflected sunlight into central towers. Electricity flowed outward across transmission lines feeding 3 states. From a distance it looked calm. Predictable. Mathematical. But inside the control building, alarms had begun flashing. Isaac Bell arrived just after noon. He had driven through the desert all morning. Following the coordinates from the ledger. The 4th mark. Pressure point. When he entered the control building, technicians were already moving between consoles. Voices tense. Systems running hot. Bell recognized the look instantly. Pressure inside a system that was designed for precision. Overload risk, he asked one technician. The woman nodded quickly. Demand spike from the western grid. How long? 10 minutes before the regulator's trip. Bell looked toward the power map. Energy lines glowed across the screen. Too much current moving through a single transmission corridor. If the system shut down suddenly, millions would lose power. Hospitals. Traffic systems. Airports. The desert facility sat at the center of the imbalance. Pressure. Waiting. The technician glanced at him. You at the energy board? Bell shook his head. Just watching. She frowned but returned to the console. Bell moved toward the window overlooking the solar field. The mirrors shimmered beneath the sun. Thousands of perfect reflections. Perfect systems. Until pressure shifted. He saw the traveler standing outside near the fence line. Watching the facility quietly. Bell stepped outside. The heat hit immediately. Dry. Intense. The traveler looked toward the power towers. Energy behaves like water, he said calmly. Bell nodded. Pressure moves through the system. Yes. And someone decides where it goes. The traveler's eyes moved toward the control building. They will soon. Inside the facility, alarms intensified. The technicians gathered around the central console. Energy load rising faster than predicted. If they shut down the main corridor, the grid collapse would ripple across multiple states. If they kept it open, transformers could explode. Pressure. Choice. Echo. Bell stepped back inside. He could feel the tension now. Not in the machines. In the people. Systems never fail alone. They fail where human decisions meet mechanical limits. What's your bypass capacity? He asked the technician. She hesitated. Minimal. Where? She pointed toward a secondary transmission route. A maintenance corridor connecting to an unfinished backup grid. Normally it carried almost no load. Not rated for current demand. But it existed. Bell nodded slowly. Redirect the pressure. The technician shook her head. That corridor can't handle the load. Bell answered quietly. It doesn't need to handle all of it. Just enough. Just long enough. Momentum moving sideways instead of forward. The technician looked uncertain. But the alarms kept rising. 2 minutes before system failure. She entered the override code. The backup corridor activated. Power surged through the secondary line. Transformers hummed violently. The load split across 2 pathways. Not safe. Not stable. But balanced. The primary corridor cooled slightly. The system held. Pressure moved. Outside, the traveler looked toward the towers. A faint shimmer crossed the mirrors. The desert wind shifted. Clouds formed far above the horizon. Tiny. Barely visible. Just enough to dim the sunlight striking the panels. Energy production dropped a fraction. Exactly enough to stabilize the system. Echo. Inside the control room the alarms faded. The technician exhaled. Load stabilized. Bell nodded. Pressure had moved again. Not prevented. Redirected. When Bell stepped outside, the traveler had already turned away. Walking slowly toward the open desert. Bell called after him. 2 left. The traveler paused. Yes. Bell asked the question that had been forming all morning. What happens at the last one? The traveler looked toward the horizon. The spiral listens. Bell frowned slightly. And then? The traveler answered softly. Then the world answers. Bell watched him walk into the desert heat until the figure disappeared against the light. When he turned back toward the facility fence, something lay in the dust. A small brass plate. Engraved. The spiral. He picked it up slowly. Warm metal in his hand. 4 pressure points passed. 1 remained. Far away in the archive building, Thomas Hale turned another blank page in the ledger. The pen hovered above the paper. Waiting. And somewhere across the continent, the final pressure point had already begun forming. Night arrived slowly across the continent. The harbor lights flickered on first along the coast. Then the desert cooled beneath fading heat. Then the mountain valleys darkened one by one. 5 pressure points had been written into the ledger. 4 had already turned. The spiral was nearly complete. 1 choice remained. The final coordinate lay far from cities. Far from rail lines. Far from power grids or harbors. A stretch of open desert where wind moved across stone and dry grass without interruption. Most people never visited the place. There were no roads. No buildings. Just land. And sky. And the quiet accumulation of pressure no one noticed until it moved. Thomas Hale closed the archive building early that evening. The ledger rested inside his coat. For decades he had never removed it from the desk. But tonight felt different. Tonight the spiral would complete its first turn. And the final entry needed to be written where the pressure appeared. Not afterward. During. He locked the door behind him and drove west. Isaac Bell arrived shortly before midnight. His car headlights cut across the desert plateau. The air felt cooler now. Wind carrying faint dust across the ground. When he stepped out of the vehicle, he saw the traveler standing near a cluster of low stones. Watching the horizon. Bell approached quietly. 4 points past, he said. The traveler nodded. Yes. And the 5th? The traveler looked toward the stars above the desert. Already forming. Elena Ruiz arrived next. Her truck lights swept across the plain. She stepped out carrying the brass whistle. Behind her, miles away, trains continued moving through the mountains. Steel momentum never stopped. But tonight the spiral's final pressure did not belong to steel. It belonged to people. Daniel Mercer arrived just before midnight. Salt still clung to his jacket from the harbor wind. He carried the brass compass. The needle trembled slightly in the desert air. Then steadied. Pointing toward the traveler. Aaron Cole arrived last. Dust trailing behind his truck. The survey tag rested in his hand. 5 people now stood beneath the open desert sky. The historian. The scientist. The dispatcher. The engineer. The sailor. 5 witnesses to a pattern centuries in motion. And one traveler who had watched it longer than any of them. Thomas opened the ledger. The final page waited. Blank. Waiting for the last entry. Bell looked toward the traveler. So this is the last pressure point. The traveler nodded. Yes. Elena crossed her arms. What's the choice? The traveler looked across the empty desert. Listen. At first they heard nothing. Just wind brushing across dry grass. Then, a distant rumble. Not thunder. Something deeper. Aaron felt it first. The ground vibrating faintly beneath his boots. Seismic pressure, he said quietly. Bell checked the monitoring app on his phone. A fault line crossed the plateau beneath them. Inactive for decades. But now the sensors showed movement. Pressure building underground. If the fault ruptured suddenly, the shock wave could damage nearby towns. Power. Corridors. Water systems. Everything connected through the same fragile network. Thomas looked down at the ledger. What do we do? The traveler answered calmly. You choose. Elena frowned. How do we redirect an earthquake? Aaron spoke slowly. You can't stop the pressure. Bell nodded. But you can change where it releases. The desert plateau stretched wide around them. Fault lines rarely break at random. They follow weaknesses in the earth. Channels where pressure can escape. Aaron looked across the terrain. One direction led toward the towns in the valley. Another toward empty desert. If the rupture followed the valley fault, the shock could damage thousands of homes. If pressure shifted west, the land would crack harmlessly across empty ground. But influencing a seismic release required one thing. Weight. Momentum. A controlled detonation along the western ridge could trigger a smaller rupture first, redirecting the larger stress line. But the explosives stored in Aaron's truck were meant for construction blasting. Too small. Unless, Aaron looked at the vehicles around them. Fuel. Engines. Pressure. Bell understood immediately. You're thinking of a chain detonation. Aaron nodded. Controlled. Barely. Elena exhaled slowly. You're talking about blowing half this ridge open. Better the ridge than the town. Daniel looked toward the traveler. Is this the choice? The traveler answered quietly. It is the moment. Aaron began working quickly. Fuel lines. Detonator wires. Positioning vehicles along the shallow fault crack running west. The ground vibration intensified. The pressure beneath the earth rising toward release. Bell checked the seismic readings again. 2 minutes. Maybe less. Thomas held the ledger open. The pen trembling slightly in his hand. Waiting. Aaron stepped back. The charges were ready. One trigger. One chance. Redirect pressure. Or let the fault break naturally toward the valley. He looked at the others. No one spoke. Because the spiral never forced a decision. It waited for alignment. Aaron pressed the trigger. The explosion cracked across the desert. A chain of controlled blasts rippling along the western ridge. Dust and stone erupted into the night air. The ground shook violently beneath their feet. Then, a deep tearing sound rolled across the plateau. The fault line split. But not toward the valley. West. Across empty desert. Pressure released into open land. Miles of silent ground shifting where no one lived. Echo. The rumbling faded slowly. Wind carried dust across the plain. The earth stilled. Bell checked the seismic feed. The rupture followed the ridge. Aaron exhaled. Then the towns are safe. Thomas wrote the final entry. Pressure, tectonic fault release. Choice, controlled detonation redirected rupture. Echo, seismic line shifted west across uninhabited desert. He placed the pen down. The spiral's first turn was complete. The traveler looked toward the horizon. The reckoning has begun. Elena frowned. That didn't feel like reckoning. The traveler smiled faintly. It never does. Thomas closed the ledger. The book felt lighter somehow. As if the centuries of pressure inside its pages had finally exhaled. Bell looked toward the spiral map on his phone. The pattern had completed a full rotation. Then, it continued. A new line forming beyond the circle. A larger spiral beginning. Daniel looked at the traveler. So this never ends. The traveler shook his head gently. Pressure never ends. Choice never ends. Echo never ends. The wind moved across the desert again. Carrying dust across the fresh fracture in the earth. A scar in the land. A reminder of pressure released. And the spiral turning once more. In forgotten places where patterns gather quietly, justice does not shout, it whispers, and every act leaves an echo. You have been listening to Whispers of Reckoning. The spiral has completed its first turn. But the pattern is still growing. And somewhere, the next pressure point is already forming. Every act leaves an echo.